Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Chelsea Cupit. I'm a consulting manager with Siemens PTI, not to be confused with Siemens Energy, who is more in the development space. At Siemens PTI, we provide marketing consulting services for long-term market strategy and risk management all across North America. So I don't know about all of y'all, but I feel like recently, every single time I check my phone, there's a new executive order being developed or new tariffs being announced. And I know 2 or 3 minutes later, I'm going to get a Teams chat asking from our lead team if we put this in our models yet and how this is going to affect our long-term strategy. So with that, I'm excited to share some of our insights on how federal policy shifts could reshape New England's energy future. Now, while this particular analysis is specific to New England, the challenges we face can be applied anywhere throughout the country. So my goal today is to give you some of those insights that you can apply to your own regions. Okay, so for today's agenda, we're going to do a brief overview of some of the recent executive order summaries, and then we'll dive into some of the scenario analysis and key drivers, and then some of the results and key takeaways, and I'll try and keep it brief. I know the schedule's been a little wonky today, so I'll try and keep it pretty brief and give some time for some Q&A afterwards. All right, ooh, that's great. Okay, so on this slide, this is a brief overview of some of the recent executive orders signed by our current administration lately. I know that this is a lot of words. And I believe these slides will be distributed, but if they're not distributed by Energy Exemplar, I'm more than happy to kind of send this presentation over to anyone who might be interested. So with that, we're not going to go through all of these individually, but there are 3 key ones that I did want to kind of bring up as they are particularly important when looking at this study for ISO New England. The first one, which is probably the most important for ISO New England, is the current freeze on offshore wind leasing. And then additionally, we have the Unleashing American Energy, which really promotes fossil fuel development, but also restricts some of the funding for renewable energy and EV incentives. And then thirdly, we have a recent 25% tariff on steel and aluminum that is expected to impact the cost of materials for both renewable energy and fossil generation. Okay, so with that, this is a brief overview just showing some of the regulations that are shaping our energy grid today. The main takeaway on this particular slide is that while these executive orders can create quick, drastic changes, they're not necessarily set in stone for long-term policy. Such as one of the examples is the Inflation Reduction Act. An executive order is not going to be able to completely overturn the Inflation Reduction Act. That is required through congressional approval. So the color coding here shows the level of flexibility that some of these executive orders might have on some of the key regulations that play a role in today's energy grid. So those red at the tops, those cannot be overturned or even slightly altered through executive orders. Those need to go through legislative action. While those in yellow, while they can't be completely overturned through executive orders, they can be altered slightly through executive orders, but for the most part, to be completely overturned or changed completely, they'll need to go through legislative action. And then those in green are a lot more flexible when it comes to the changes from executive orders. All right, so diving into our scenario analysis. So we've developed 4 distinct scenarios to try and capture how these federal executive orders will shape ISO New England's energy grid going forward. So we utilized a multiple scenario approach to try and capture a wide range of possible outcomes and put those through the Aurora long-term capacity expansion to get various different impacts on the long-term capacity build in ISO New England. So in the table here as shown, you can see kind of our 4 base scenarios. So our base is kind of a baseline approach or a pre-Trump administration executive order outlook to provide more of a status quo. So any of the offshore wind projects that are currently planned in ISO New England are expected to remain remain intact and on schedule with their current expectations, as well as the federal ITC and PTC benefits as stated in the IRA, and then also that federal EV tax credit is expected to remain in place. For our scenario 1, we expected a 5-year delay with some holdups for some of the federal offshore wind leasing. So those who have not secured federal leases are expected to be delayed about 5 years or so, pushing back some of the renewable energy goals for ISO New England. However, we do expect or assume that the federal ITC and PTC benefits remain intact, as well as the federal EV tax credit. Now, scenario 2 takes a more conservative approach where any offshore wind projects that have not yet secured a federal lease are expected to be canceled completely and not included in the analysis for the study horizon. On top of no of those additional offshore wind projects, we also made the assumption that the federal ITC and PTC benefits are no longer on the table. And then scenario 3 is kind of an additional layer onto scenario 2, which utilizes the same build out. However, we did assume that there was no federal EV tax credit, therefore driving down the demand due to EVs. Now, it's important to note that each region requires these tailored scenarios based on its specific policy sensitivities. For a more obvious example, the offshore wind inclusion part of the scenario, you wouldn't include if you were doing this in, say, SPP or so. Okay, so on this slide, this is just showing a map of the current offshore wind developments within the ISO New England region. So these are kind of color-coded. Those in blue, they're kind of the smaller ones over here, Vineyard and Revolution. Those make up about 1.5 gigawatts of the 7 total gigawatts of planned offshore wind development. These are the only 2 that have currently secured federal leases, and therefore these are the only 2 that are assumed to remain intact and in place throughout all the 4 scenarios that we just recently went over. The rest that are in red, as you can see, are planned but have not yet officially secured federal leases. These are the ones that are at risk for delays or cancellations moving forward in those individual scenarios. So as you can see, these projects are going to play a critical role in helping ISO New England get to some of their renewable energy goals, and it'll have pretty big impacts on the future of ISO New England. Okay, so diving into some of our EV incentive rollbacks. So currently within the IRA, there is a $7,500 EV tax credit, which is currently facing scrutiny under the current administration. So within some of those scenarios, we did create an analysis in which that $7,500 EV tax incentive was removed. Now, despite these cancellations, ISO New England's EV demand is still expected to remain strong. However, within ISO New England, some of the state legislation has some pretty good support on EV. So there are some state level incentives for electric vehicle adoption, as well as some infrastructure programs supporting EV adoption. So it could vary by region. ISO New England, without that $7,500 tax credit, is expected to reduce the EV demand about 2.5% by 2040, which may be on the more conservative end in comparison to other regions that might not have that strong state level support. Okay, so another key driver of kind of the market build out within ISO New England is going to be their state RPS targets. So in comparison to the national average, ISO New England states have pretty aggressive renewable targets, kind of shown here in the map. So you've got a lot that have some of those 2050, 80%, 100% by 2050 goals. And those offshore wind projects play a key role in trying to meet these state level targets. This kind of goes hand in hand with the RPS standards. These states also have relatively aggressive carbon reduction targets in comparison to some of the national average. So once again, offshore wind is going to play a key role in helping these states meet their carbon reduction and greenhouse gas reduction targets as well. Okay, and last but not least, we did want to take a quick analysis of the 25% steel tariff which was announced on February 10th, 2025, and went into effect as of March 12th. A similar tariff was put into place back in March of 2018, although that one was a little bit less restrictive as that was specific for certain countries, whereas this recent one is kind of a sweeping 25% for all steel and aluminum. But what we did notice is they have very similar price fluctuations in which the price of steel jumps immediately after the announcement and not necessarily after the implementation of these tariffs. So following the February 10th announcement, we saw about $150 per ton steel price increase over the course of 2 weeks before the implementation was even put into place. As far as the expected costs, we do expect this to impact the cost of renewable and gas fossil fuel resources, probably in the range of about 3 to 5%, but as mentioned, the 2018 was selective to certain countries, so there was some ways to work around those tariffs, whereas this recent is a lot more broad and applies to all countries. So we're consistently tracking kind of the cost of new resources due to this increase in steel prices. Okay, so jumping into our capacity build out. After running these scenarios through the Aurora LTCE, you can see here the base scenario on the very left, which has all of your ISO New England planned resource additions, has the lowest amount of installed capacity, especially in comparison to scenarios 2 and 3, which have absolutely no offshore wind additions. And this is because in order to make up for that missing offshore wind, we had to add in a lot of solar and storage combination to help out with those non-solar hours. Now, if you look at the model output on an unconstrained basis, the ISO New England region really wants, the Aurora model really wants to build onshore wind if offshore wind is not an option. That's because in this generic climate, wind is preferable. It's got pretty strong wind, pretty low solar, so it really wants to build a lot of wind. However, there are severe transmission constraints within the ISO New England region that actually capped the onshore wind possibilities to around 3 to 4 gigawatts. So we did have to apply that constraint within our modeling to see what the next best outcome was. So as you can see here, without that onshore wind capability, a lot of solar and storage is required to make up for the lack of offshore wind energy in those non-solar hours, especially with the growing demand for load. Okay. And then looking at it on an energy and capacity basis, so these delays in offshore wind projects definitely lead to a modest rise in energy costs. On a capacity cost basis, all of these scenarios are expected to kind of hit net cone, so they do have relatively similar capacity costs on that end. However, on an energy basis, we do see a steady rise in energy costs as you remove the offshore wind capabilities. Between scenario 2 and 3, you do see that slight decrease, and that's strictly due to the lack of EV demand, or that 2.5% decrease in EV demand. Therefore, it's got less energy requirements, therefore a little bit lower on the energy cost basis. All right, and now on this slide, a brief view on kind of the grid operations and how that's affected when we remove some of that offshore wind capability within ISO New England. So you can see the base case on the left for a random day in February of 2040 when all this offshore wind is expected to be in operation. You can see that offshore wind plays a critical role in supplying some 24-hour energy kind of in this tealish color, and acts a lot like a baseload generation on certain days when the wind profile is really strong. The solar, there's still obviously some solar and storage that comes into play, as there are some limitations on that offshore wind, but a general amount of solar to fill those daytime hours, and then charging up some of the storage to utilize in the off-peak hours. However, you can see in this blue, this is still 2040, and so those renewable targets aren't 100%. So there is still some wiggle room when it comes to that gas CC, and it's being utilized in some of those non-solar hours to help support that load. However, when you move to scenario 2, which has no new offshore wind, you've got a lot more solar that really needs to fill that lack of offshore wind during the daytime hours, as well as trying to charge up your storage resources to try and fill those non-daytime hours. So you can see this giant amount of purple here is just the storage and then needing to get refilled and then being able to kind of supply some of that energy in the nighttime as well. And then you can see the hit on the gas CC, which really needs to increase because that storage and solar capability just isn't quite there yet by 2040. And this really just kind of exacerbates by 2050 as you have more stringent renewable portfolio standards within those next 10 years or so, where this gas CC really needs to be filled by some other form of clean energy, whether it be more combination of solar and storage or additional transmission capability to support some more onshore wind for ISO New England. Okay, so with that, some of the key takeaways from this analysis that we have is that while these executive orders that are coming in fast, they're coming in hot, while they can drive some immediate change, it is important to kind of look at the regulations that these are surrounding and know that these aren't necessarily set in stone the minute that they're announced. So understanding key regulatory policies and their implications are a big part of resource planning when it comes to this particular environment. Second, tailored scenarios are essential, as the effects for what we saw in ISO New England aren't necessarily going to be applicable to all other regions. So you really have to tailor all your scenarios to apply to the specific region that you're looking at. Third, recent executive orders can impact state-level environmental goals. So all of these executive orders are on a federal basis. However, all the individual states are really driving kind of some of their renewable portfolio standards on a state-by-state level. And those states still have to meet those goals with the support of federal policy or not. Four, for ISO New England specifically, onshore wind limitations due to land and transmission constraints make offshore wind a highly favorable resource, and it makes it even more essential to kind of support those RPS targets, carbon reduction goals, and the reliability purposes. And so in the future, if offshore wind is no longer an option, alternatives to fill those off-peak hours while still meeting environmental goals are definitely necessary. And then 5, as emission reduction targets kind of goes hand in hand with 4, some long duration energy storage are going to play a key role in helping meet those non-off-peak hours. And I think that's kind of applicable for all regions and not necessarily ISO New England. And that is all I have for you today, so I will answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. We have time for 2 questions if anybody has any. Right here,
It's really dark, so I'm going to go back.
How do you take account for the capacity accreditation of the different resources, and how do they compare to offshore wind accreditation?
Well, we utilize Aurora's dynamic peak credit when kind of creating the portfolio resources. Offshore wind and onshore wind both stay relatively stable. As you can see, that offshore wind, it's pretty reliable in most instances. Solar very easily goes to 0 pretty quickly with those levels of wind. So kind of similar to what you would expect, but wind does remain relatively stable throughout all the scenarios, really.
Hi, Richard Kronetsky, ISO New England.
Hi.
I appreciate the analysis. I feel like as the sole ISO New England representative, this is like single-handedly for me. So really appreciate it. So I saw on slide 12 you had done an analysis looking at capacity and energy market prices. I was wondering did you analyze at all the power purchase agreement costs associated with this as well? I know that kind of gets beyond the ISO purview, but into the kind of ratepayer structure.
Yeah, no, we didn't go that far into it. And another kind of key executive order that was kind of specific for ISO New England is some of this 10% tax on imports, which applies to Canadian imports into ISO New England, but we didn't do that deep of a dive onto this particular analysis. But we're more than happy to work with you on it.
Thanks again, Chelsea. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.